Wonderful, wonderful. So, hi everybody. I apologize in advance. I might talk sort of quickly. I've done this presentation before, and it's usually like 45 minutes, and I think I only have 30 with you. So I'll try to make it short and sweet. First of all, I'm Leah Able, and I happen to have kids in the school. I have a senior and a sophomore, and I also work for the district in the communications department, so I'm here all the time sort of representing Bloomfield schools. But today I'm here to talk to you about my family's experience in the Japanese American internment camps that happened during World War II. Now, I know right now in 9th grade, you guys have world history, and so most likely you're not going to really learn much about the internment camps until next year for American history classes. But the slideshow I'm sharing with you today gives a lot of history about the internment camps, but also about what happened to my particular family on my mother's branch. So actually, if Mr. Genevieve, if you can move a tiny bit so I can see that screen. Okay, thank you. So if we can get the next slide, that would be awesome. Thank you. Okay, so before World War II, I feel like it's important to understand what happened during World War II. The only way to understand that is what happened before it. So most Japanese Americans who lived in this country were on the West Coast. A lot of them were very successful farmers and fishermen. Even before World War II began, there was a lot of discrimination against Japanese in this country because they happened to be pretty successful. They were successful because in Japan, what did they do? Most of them were farmers and fishermen. They had that background. So when they came to this country, they were pretty good at the careers that they were, starting up. So they were successful. They were resented from the beginning. And then in 1924, Congress passed an anti-immigration law that restricted immigration from both Europe and totally barring it from Japan. So there was actually nobody coming from Japan to this country after 1924. My grandmother happened to be born in California. She was actually, her family moved here well before 1924. And my grandfather moved here when he was 16 years old, and I don't know the exact date on that. In any case, so pre-1924 immigrants came to this country. They were, Issei is what is called first generation, and then Nisei is second generation. So the people who were born in this country were American citizens. They were fully American citizens, even if they looked fully Japanese, right? Next slide, please. So hopefully you guys know this date, December 7th, 1941. That is when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and it totally changed the course of what happened during World War II, particularly in this country. So because of that bombing, it drew the United States into the war. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president at the time, he signed this executive order. It was 9066, and it was issued by General John DeWitt. So John DeWitt was the author of this executive order. FDR signed it. And what this order basically said was every single person of Japanese descent, again, even if you were a citizen born in this country, had to be evacuated from the Pacific coast and put into camps. And the idea was they were fearful that all of these Japanese who lived on the West Coast were spies. Why? Because they lived, so the West Coast, if you look at a map of the world, it's not too far from Hawaii, and then Hawaii isn't too far from Japan. So there was this idea that somehow the Japanese Americans in this country were spies. There was never any proof of it at all, but the American government was so fearful of spies that they were we have to round all of these people up. So they all get put into what are called internment camps. Next slide, please. So all of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast had literally only 2 days to evacuate. So they had 2 days to collect up the belongings that they could carry, nothing else. Anything that was, their businesses, their homes, their pets, everything had to be left behind. And they could only bring literally what they could carry. So in this picture that you see here on the slideshow, you see them all with their luggage or whatever and some bags piled up. That was all they could carry, nothing else was allowed. And a lot of people, thought, nobody had any idea how long they were going to be gone from their homes and businesses. And they thought they might be returning sort of soon, right? The government didn't say how long they were going to be gone. So a lot of people were burying their belongings and asking neighbors to take care of pets and all kinds of stories like that. And they, thought that they would be able to just go back soon after and reclaim all their belongings, but that was actually more of an anomaly. It was very rare for families to get back the stuff that they had left behind. And again, like all of their worldly possessions, their businesses, everything, they just lost everything. Oh, and the other sort of interesting fact is a lot of people trusted neighbors to watch all their stuff for them. So they would say, oh, can you watch my farm? Take care of my farm while I'm gone. Well, then what happened? The neighbors totally just took their land. And if the neighbors didn't take their land, the government often took their land. So even the few people who did try to go back and regain their possessions, they found that they had nothing to go back to. Next slide, please. Okay, so they were put onto trains and buses, and before the internment camps were ready for all of these people, there were something called assembly centers. And the assembly centers were really pretty disgusting. There were 16 temporary places. Most of them literally were like horse stalls. And they took these horse stalls and just put people into them. So they looked and smelled disgusting. They were fairgrounds and racetracks and other public facilities. And they were just slapped together quickly for all of these. It was a total of 120,000 Americans, or Japanese Americans, who were put into these places. And the sanitation and food service, all of it was below the lowest governmental, official levels, standards allowed. And some stories were horses had lived in these stalls just days before the internees were brought there. It's hard for me to read this quote. I'm going to come around here. So there's this one quote from Desert. Oh wait, sorry, same slide. Just yeah, okay. So from Desert Exile: The Uprooting of a Japanese American Family. The quote is, "The stall was about 10 by 20 feet and empty except for 3 folded army cots lying on the floor. Dust, dirt, and wood shavings covered the linoleum that had been laid over manure-covered boards. The smell of horses hung in the air, and the whitened corpses of many insects still clung to the hastily whitewashed walls." So again, just disgusting circumstances. And they were there for a while before they were moved to the next place, which was the internment camps. Okay, so next slide, please. So internment camp locations, there were 10 of them throughout the whole West and Midwest. Interestingly, there's one in Arkansas, which was as far east as they went, but most of them were in the West Coast. And each of them confined about 10,000 people into a 1.25 square mile area. A lot of people smushed together. And interestingly, every single internment camp had a lot of acreage. There were approximately 32,000 acres in a typical camp, but the idea was they were trying to keep them super confined. And most of them were in areas that were deserts. So the idea was they were totally isolated. So even if they were going to think about escaping, it would not be wise to try to escape into the middle of the desert. So all of these locations were very specifically chosen by the government to be in the middle of nowhere with no easy way to escape. And again, all these people confined in a very small area. Next slide, please. So camp conditions. There was literally barbed wire around the camps. And again, they were trying to keep them all confined, make sure nobody left. The barracks where they lived were divided into 20 by 16 foot rooms, and each room was for a whole family, numbering up to 6 people. Try to envision that. I don't know if you guys have any of you have a good sense of space. What is 20 by 16? It's not big. It's probably a quarter of the space we're in right now, maybe. Yeah, it's little. So again, up to 6 people living in that small space. And the barracks were constructed from tar paper and wood, and there was no insulation. And remember, this is the desert. Have any of you guys ever been to the desert before? Okay, what's it like in the middle of the desert? In the winter or the summer? Yeah, nothing. And in the summer, you might have crazy winds and hot, and in the winter, it's frigid cold, and there's nothing to, just think about that. No insulation at all, right? So there were people of all ages, young children to the elderly, living in these conditions for years. And the barracks lacked kitchens and water faucets and showers and toilets. So you had a barrack, and they were all numbered, and you had to, and there were 15 barracks together in a row. So you had to walk from your barrack to the places where there were kitchens and there were toilets. And then there were no walls separating the bathroom stalls in or the showers, so there was like literally no privacy at all. So you had to like leave your tiny little barrack where you lived with your family. All the barracks looked identical. You'd had to walk to go to the bathroom, and there was no privacy at all in the bathroom. And I have interviewed, so like, again, my whole family was interned other than my mom was the youngest of 5 siblings. So she was actually not interned because she was born right after the war. But I've interviewed my aunts and uncles, some of whom have passed by now, who lived there as kids. And my aunt, who remembers it because she was like in her, like maybe around 10 years old when she lived there, her story was that the worst part about her entire experience was feeling like she had no privacy, because she just, imagine you're a kid and you go to the bathroom and like all around you are just, you know, other people going to the bathroom or taking a shower. It's just, it strips you of your sense of identity. So it was a really, really hard experience for all these families. And schooling. So schooling was provided for kids, but only in English. No Japanese was taught in those schools. And every single day they pledged allegiance to the American flag, to the government that was putting them behind barbed wire for doing absolutely nothing wrong. Okay, next slide, please. So this is my mom's family. This is what it's all about. This is why I do this presentation. So this is a picture of their family when it was like before the camp. So my grandfather, who I never met, he passed away a long, long time ago. He's on the far left. My grandmother, who I did know when I was a kid, is on the far right. My oldest uncle and aunt are the 2 kids. And then the 2 young men standing are my great uncles, I guess. So all of these people were in the same barrack, because this number right here, you can see this is 6 people. They lived together in the same barrack. And then my mom's family grew and grew during the camp, because I actually had an aunt and an uncle born in the camps. Again, this camp photograph was taken before the war. It was 1941. Okay, next slide, please. So speaking of photographs, there was no cameras, no radios, nothing at all. Because again, the whole concept here was, we think the American government thought all these people were spies. So they didn't allow any kind of technology at all in the camps. So my aunt had this story where she remembered a smuggled radio, and all of the people would like gather around to listen to the news, but they had to keep it secret and you know, private, because they were afraid that if they were found out, it would be taken away. So yeah, they had to hide all their technology. So no photos at all from the entire time that my family was interned. Next slide, please. But interestingly, there are some photographs of the event. Sorry, I got a little distracted. The photographs were taken by Ansel Adams. I don't know, has anybody in this room ever heard of Ansel Adams? Very famous American photographer. Couple, maybe not. Okay, the adults in the room. So Ansel Adams was like one of the prominent American photographers in this time period. And he was basically asked by the American government to go in and photograph what was happening in the camps. But part of why he was asked to do this was because like there were rumors that like the camp conditions weren't good. And so Ansel Adams was basically asked to like, you know, make them look happy. So he goes in and he takes pictures of smiling Japanese Americans like holding cabbage and showing how productive they were. And like it was basically all a lie, because he was not showing any of the barracks or how bad their situations were. And in fact, Ansel Adams, I read an article about it, he was dumbfounded by the beauty of one particular spot there. Because some of these places, I mean, yes, they were like middle of nowhere in deserts, but some of them also sort of had a natural beauty to them. So he was like turning around and taking pictures of the mountains and stuff, but like he was not photographing the negative aspects of life that were occurring in the camps. So again, his images just showed the daily life of like agriculture and like smiling people. And yeah, that's about it from that slide. Next slide, please. So most of the Japanese Americans went along with everything that the government told them to do without question, because they just wanted to be good American citizens, or even if, again, some of them were not citizens. They were trying to prove their loyalty to the United States, most of them. But every once in a while there's an outlier. So Fred Korematsu was one of the few people who actually was against, he knew it was wrong what was happening. So he was one of the first Japanese civil rights activists. And he was born in 1919. So he was 23 years old when that executive order was placed. And he challenged the order. And he became a fugitive. He ran away. So his case eventually went to the Supreme Court. And there was this 1944 case called Korematsu versus the United States. So the Supreme Court of the United States upheld, meaning they said, what's happening in the internment camps is legal. They said it was okay. But his conviction for evading internment was overturned many decades later, so it was eventually overturned. In a United States District Court, after the disclosure of new evidence challenging the necessity of the internment, evidence which had been withheld from the courts by the United States government during the war. Wait, sorry, I just wrote that. Okay, yeah, so it was overturned because of that evidence. And eventually the ruling was condemned in the Trump versus Hawaii case that was in 2018, just a few years ago. It was finally condemned by the United States government. In 2010, California established Fred Korematsu Day, which is annually on January 30th, which is his birthday. And this was actually the first statewide day in United States history named for an Asian American. So he is sort of cool that we have a day named after him. Next slide, please. Okay, so next part goes, this hits home with me, it happened to my family. So there was something called the no-no boys. There were these loyalty tests that were given to every man in the internment camps. Every single man of like 18 and over. And the idea behind this loyalty test was like to figure out who was actually loyal and who wasn't. So there were a lot of questions, but the two most important questions had to do with the willingness to fight in the armed forces and the allegiance to the United States. So 65,000 people answered yes to both questions, so they were fine, they stayed put. And the people who answered no to both questions were called no-no boys. And all of the no-no boys and their families, which happened to be my grandfather, they were considered more dangerous. And they were sent to a more militaristic camp, which was called Tule Lake. And it was in Northern California. So this one, they had more armed guards, more barbed wire. They were really trying to make sure these people who they deemed the most dangerous could not in any way escape or do any harm. And so again, my grandfather was a no-no boy. Can you, next slide, please? So again, my grandfather, as I mentioned before, he died before I was born, like long before. So nobody in the family really ever had the chance to ask him questions about why he answered no and no to those questions. But my guess, and based on family conversations, was that he was not disloyal to the United States. We think that he just, like, his family was growing. He had 2 kids when he entered the internment camps. He actually had 2 more kids when he was in the internment camps, which is amazing to me. And so, I mean, here's a man who has 4 kids and a wife and brothers, and they're all together, and like, he didn't want to leave them to go serve for the United States Army, which was interning the rest of his family. So again, I don't know exactly what his reasonings were, but so he said no. And what's interesting is that there were quite a few Nisei, primarily second-generation Japanese Americans, who did volunteer. And they were passionate about showing their loyalty to this country, because to them, like, this was the opportunity to prove that they were United States citizens and they cared about this country and they were loyal. So what's interesting is that they served in what was called the 442nd Regiment, and it ended up being the most decorated unit in the military during World War II, which is fascinating to me. So you have, all these young men who look like the enemy, and they were really doing their best to prove their loyalty. And there's a picture there of President Truman saluting the members of that 442nd Infantry. So again, well after World War II was over. Okay, next slide, please. So war is coming to an end, 1995-ish, and most Japanese Americans, as I mentioned before, they couldn't return to California for a variety of reasons. Most importantly of which, there was still a ton of discrimination. That people, during the entire war, there was so much negative propaganda about the Japanese, that like for those Japanese Americans to return to the West Coast where they were sort of the most hated in this country, like it just was illogical. So a lot of them, they lost all their belongings that I mentioned before. And on that picture on the slide, you can see an image of some of the propaganda that was being used in that time period that really put a lot of Americans against the Japanese. So in any case, it's after the war. Finding work was like the most important thing. So this is a little funny, but my mother's brother's wife's father, he was considered a draft resistor because he didn't want to fight in the war, probably like my grandfather, while his family was interned. And so he was told he either had to find a job or go to jail. That's what was happening to men who couldn't find a job. So he happened to get really lucky. His interviewer after the war liked him a lot and told him to go to Seabrook Farm. So that's the next slide, please. So there's this fascinating history. So it's right at the end of the war. This guy named Charles Seabrook, he lives in South New Jersey. And he was a farmer, and he was trying to get his farm up and running. And he knows that these Japanese have a history of being pretty successful farmers on the West Coast. So it's like a no-brainer, right? Win-win. Bring in some of these people who need jobs, and they have a background in farming, and they're willing to work for almost nothing. So he started getting more and more Japanese Americans to come to his farm. And so it actually started with 2 internees who heard about Seabrook, and then they kept telling their friends, and then it created quite a large community of Japanese Americans in South Jersey. So he recruits all these Japanese Americans. There were a total of about 600 families, numbering 2,500 altogether, which is probably one of the largest Japanese American communities in this country after World War II, because again, a lot of the rest of them sort of scattered. And what was also interesting about Seabrook was he accepted refugees from Europe, migrant African Americans, Scots-Irish from the Appalachia area. So it was like a really diverse community. And this is where my mother grew up. And again, the Japanese Americans had jobs. They were happy. They got to, they weren't put into jail. They had jobs, and they had roofs over their heads. And they primarily had jobs in farming, which is what a lot of them were doing before the war anyway. Okay, next slide. So a little bit about life in Seabrook Farms. There were cinder block houses, which is probably better than those tar paper barracks. Not a lot better, but better. And they had, sorry, I can't read my own work there. Became home. Oh yeah, okay, I mentioned before, 2,500 Japanese Americans lived there. But before the cinder block homes were built, there were tar papered barracks at Seabrook, just like at camp. So they actually went to tar paper barracks before the cinder block stuff was all there. And they worked 12-hour shifts in the farms, 80-hour work weeks, and they had really low hourly wages in the fields. But again, at least they had jobs. So my grandmother, Shizuko, this is my mom's mom, she was a frozen food assembly line worker. And my grandfather, his name was Jack, he was a carpenter, and he actually ended up building some stuff for Charles Seabrook. So he had some, position of power a little bit because he actually knew him. And then the cinder block homes had no insulation, just like the tar paper places they were coming from. But again, at least they had bathroom walls for once. That was exciting, and there was no barbed wire, so it was a home. And those pictures right there, I don't know if you can see them very well, but that's what Seabrook Farms looked like. That's where my grandmother, Shizuko, lived until she died. And I remember visiting her in that place. I mean, it was just shockingly small. I mean, like the tar paper barracks from the internment camps, it was not big at all. They were I would imagine maybe half of this room, something like that. Maybe a little bigger than half of this room. And that's where my family, again, 5 kids, grew up. Next slide, please. So one of the things I always talk about at the end here is this idea of assimilation. What happened after the war was, and again, it happened during the war too, there was this big push to just fit in, to be American, to speak English. And so they all assimilated, which is different from acculturation. Acculturation has to do a little bit more with the idea of taking elements of your culture and sort of blending it with your new culture of where you live. That wasn't happening with my mom's family. It was all about assimilation. So my mom, the youngest of 5, spoke only English. she grew up in a family where her oldest sibling spoke Japanese, and her mom and dad spoke Japanese, but she spoke only English. So I had a super Americanized, fully Japanese mom. It was always really sad to me that I had no Japanese culture, maybe not none, but like very, very, very minimal Japanese culture from my fully Japanese mom because she was born right after World War II. And let's see what else is on there. Okay, yeah, the other concept that I think is really important to share is the lack of bitterness. Now, a lot of people would think, like in my generation, like we have bitterness. A lot of people of my generation are like, I can't believe this happened on American soil. How was that able to happen during World War II? But when they were going through it, they actually did not have bitterness. And another really interesting story from one of my living aunts is that she felt like it was actually maybe an okay thing that they were all rounded up because there was so much discrimination and hatred on the West Coast. They were fearful for their lives. That's how bad it was. And when those trains were that they all had to board to get to first the assembly centers and then the internment camps, those trains had to be blacked out on the windows. Anybody have any theories why? Yeah? You got it, exactly. When people saw that there were Japanese inside of those trains, they were angry. They thought that they were, the enemy. They were throwing things at them. So the people in charge ended up blacking everything out. So that's how much anger there was. So my aunt actually felt like it was safer for them to be all together in these internment camps than to remain in their homes and businesses where they were hated so much on the West Coast. And there are also stories about like signs and windows, like, on the West Coast before everything happened with the internment camps. There was so much anti-Asian sentiment. There were like signs on windows saying, not serving Japanese here, all kinds of stuff like that. So it's really interesting. They truly didn't have bitterness. They just went with most of them, other than people like Fred Korematsu. The vast majority truly went with the flow. And there's this phrase in Japanese, and I do not know Japanese, but I've like read a lot. And so there's this term that's shikataganai, and it basically means like don't make any waves. It is what it is. We have to accept it and move on. And it's sort of just the part of Japanese culture. And so again, they really were fine with it. I mean, not fine with it. I'm sure they were not happy, but they went with the flow. They lived with it. And I think about how, like in my generation, again, a couple generations removed, like all my cousins and I were fine. Like we all got educated. We all, like we managed to come back from that terrible part of American history. But I think it's really important for your generation to understand what happened during that part of American history, because it impacted a whole lot of lives and offended so much. Actually there's one more slide, or two more slides, I think. Any questions from anybody? None? Okay. And the next slide, actually, after that. One of the things I like to share is that you guys have a really cool new learning community library. I don't know if you guys have paid any attention to it. They're beautiful out in the hallways. And one of the books on there is called Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. It's a historical fiction book all about the internment camps. And if any of you are really interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend it. It's a great book. As are any of these other texts that are on there. They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. George Takei is one of the actors who was in Star Trek, and he's really awesome. But he was interned during World War II, and his story is actually very, very parallel to what happened to my family. Like he also had no boys in his family. So that's a really, really great graphic novel that I highly recommend. And the other thing, also George Takei was involved in the creation of Allegiance, which is a musical. So for any of you who like theater, that's a great way to learn about it in a sort of more fun theatrical format. So lots of good resources out there to learn about it. Again, any more questions at all? I'm sort of curious. Have any of you ever learned about any of this in any classes throughout your experiences? Okay, so a couple of you. Yeah, that's good to know. Next year, again, in American history, I believe that there's a unit on it. But if any of you ever have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. Bye. Bye. Thank you.